So this is our monthly webinar. Today's session is the topic of the top 10 takeaways from the recently wrapped up Agile 2016 conference, and we do this every year. We meaning Vinayak Joglekar, our CTO and co-founder based in India, and I'm Hemant Elhence, based here in Dallas. And so with that, let's move to the next page. And you guys, the general pattern we do with these webinars will follow the same, which is roughly 45 minutes or so, maybe close to 55 minutes today, given the nature of topic. We will have our topics of top 10, which is actually a little more than 10. And you guys ask questions along the way, and we'll pick up those questions that warrant to be handled along with the flow. Otherwise, we'll hopefully still have time at the end to cover any remaining general questions related to this topic. And we'll make the document available to you after the webinar, to those who registered and attended the webinar. With that, let me start. Make sure that my slides are advancing here. Okay. So let's quick. I'm going to speed up this just to make sure we spend more time on the content and less on the setup. Bear with me, guys. Okay, let's see. Okay, the conference was last week of July, so we're just a few weeks done from it. It was the record largest conference in the history of Agile conference, 2,500 or so participants, large number of tracks, so many sessions, 270 or so to attend, and usual 4 special tracks they had. One is called Agile Boot Camp, which is for the Agile 101 style content. Then an opposite of it, which is stalwart sessions, which are essentially seasoned Agile practitioners, many of them who were essentially signatories for the Agile Manifesto in 2001. They do a session in a fishbowl format in the conference, and that tackles really corner cases topic and the practice of Agile, which is well beyond the normal issues that average team runs into. So those are very helpful also for some part of the audience. Then there's a series of experience reports, which are people who have been practicing Agile. They come and report back certain aspects of it, and those are very valuable for all the audience. And then there is a format called lightning talks, which is essentially 3 to 5 minute, very fast paced. In each session there are 8 to 10 people who come one by one and just speak for 3 to 5 minutes in a pecha kucha style rapid fire phase manner, and that also has its own value, and I attended some of those also, which were very valuable. And we had 3 keynotes, one by Jürgen Appello on managing for happiness on Monday morning, and then Joshua Krivensky talking about modern Agile on Wednesday morning, and we'll cover some of those takeaways in today's session. And Kerry Fish covered leadership for Genius Tribes on Friday morning, which was also excellent, all excellent keynotes. So with that, let's go to the next page, which is just a little disclaimer from our side that between Vinayak and I, of the 270 sessions or so, we attended between the two of us probably close to 40 sessions. So we have 15 to 20% kind of a representative session that we are reporting back. But more importantly, we are giving reference to the material that we are picking up. So you guys, when you get the document, you can follow up on any of the sessions that may strike resonance with you. And some of the content that we covers multiple sessions, and sometimes multiple topics come out of the same session. So it's not a one-to-one mapping between sessions and the top 10 topics that we cover. But we actually have 12 plus 2, so 12 meaning 6 topics each that Vinayak and I took away, and will alternate in covering those. And then each of us has a placeholder, or what we call interesting sound bites, things that we heard were interesting, thought-provoking, but didn't warrant a page by itself, any of those. So the Vinayak has a collection of those that he'll go through, and I have mine that I'll go through at the end. But otherwise, each of us has 6, and it will alternate. With that, let me turn it over to Vinayak to go through his. Vinayak, maybe I'll give you the control. That will make sure you can go at your pace. So I'll make you a presenter in this case.
Okay.
Let me do that.
On your screen sharing.
Okay. So with that, Vinayak, I'm making you, if I can find you here as a panelist. And let's just keep an eye on the time. And maybe Vinayak, you maintain control, because I think that your topics have more builds and pages that instead of going the exercise of passing back and forth, you can maintain control of the PowerPoint that way.
Yeah, but then now it's saying if I'm the presenter, I just need the control. I don't need to be the presenter. So, I suggest that you keep the control and I'll tell you when to advance. That would be easier, because now if I show my screen, the slide deck will have to be different.
Okay. I see. Got it. Okay, so we'll go with that. Maybe you just tell me then. Yeah. But Vinayak is saying I should just advance. So in which case, let's just go with that, Vinayak. So you just tell me, so I'll get you back to your page of the first takeaway that you're presenting, and then we'll go from there. Okay. So
all right. So so all of you should take a look at this. About a year and a half old Standish Group State of Agility report, where I would like you to note that Agile has been successful since as you can see, 39% of all Agile projects are successful vis-a-vis 11% of waterfall projects. And the other thing that I would like you to notice is that smaller projects are more likely to be successful than larger projects. For example, 58% of small size projects are successful as against only 18% of large size projects, which means it makes sense for us to break down big projects into smaller projects. But more importantly, I would like you to your attention to be drawn to the orange or the amber column, where 52% of Agile projects are challenged. So why is it so? I mean, in spite of us practicing Agile for so long, why is it that 52% of Agile projects are still challenged, and in which way are they challenged? So let's advance to the next slide and see what are the reasons why these projects are challenged. So you'll notice that there are various reasons why it happens. 50 to 80% of the projects fail to meet their goals. So they start with a certain set of goals, and then they end up with only 50 to 80% of them being met. Second is 1 in 4 projects fail to reach the market. So you have everything, you're all dressed up, but nowhere to go. So that's the case with 1 in 4 projects. One product from a suite fail at launch. You launch it, you go, but then it doesn't really is not successful. The most important thing, and we are going to focus on this today, is 64% of the features are never used. So this is the usability or user experience aspect of it, that your product is built, the features are working as per the requirements, but users are not using them. They are not behaving the way you were expecting them to behave. So why is that? That's because your user experience is not engaging enough for users to be engaged. So let's see what we can do and what is the reason why this is happening. So let's advance to the next slide, where I can offer a little bit of explanation why this is happening. So why this is happening is, one of the reasons is we go on building the product without really showing it to users. So as you can see, the green colored iterations are the iterations where you are delivering to the user. Now we do build in a more or less continuous way in short 2-week or 4-week iterations, but we don't deliver as frequently. We don't show what we build as frequently to the users. So the feedback that comes from the users is not getting baked into what we are building. So as a result, what we are building is not engaging enough for the users. So what do we do? So one of the sessions, so let's advance to the next slide, just the first build. So what we were doing, we were having agile sprints. Go to the next one. Circa 2006, we used to have the agile sprint preceded by a big design upfront with the user experience designers who were like, very, you can say, isolated in their own ivory towers, people who were really like unicorns, highly paid professionals with ponytails sitting in and basically doing creative work. Those were the people who were thinking of the user experience up front. And then there was this cross-functional team of product owner, developer, and tester doing the grunt work of building the product. And then they used to hand it over to the IT operations team to actually do the release of the product to the in production. In this, as you can see, obviously the product owner and IT operations are bearing the brunt because they're not very happy because IT operations would be spending endless hours on weekends trying to make things work, and the product owner would always be the proverbial single ringable neck. So that was the situation circa 2006. Going forward, circa 2011, the situation changed a little bit better with the advent of DevOps. So now you have this new concept where the operations were part of the cross-functional team. So you have the product owner, developer, tester, and DevOps, and now the delivery was happening in a continuous way, so that the risk that was involved at the end in deploying something which was never deployed before is reduced. So going forward, now this is the first year, 2016, that we heard an experience report from an Australian company where they have this concept of lean UX, where instead of doing the big design upfront, they were kind of running it along with the sprints. So the lean UX designer would be a part of the cross-functional team, and each iteration would actually be validating a hypothesis, and it could be a kind of a hypothesis-driven development sprint. At the end of every sprint, you have some kind of learning that happens, and the user feedback gets baked into the iterations, thus hopefully making user experience more engaging for the user. And that probably is the way going forward that we would be trying to address this problem of low user engagement. With that, I'm going to spend some more time talking about some of the user experience practices which we kind of practiced in the conference. So as you saw, UX designer is a role, not a fixed designation. So it could be that you don't have to have a unicorn hired only for this role. It could be anyone who is picking up the lean UX principles. UX design was done as a part of the sprint, as we already saw, and each sprint had a distinct hypothesis to validate. So these are the three main things to note here. With this, let's advance to the next slide, please.
Okay. So I'll take the second takeaway, which is my first takeaway from this conference, was under this category of modern Agile. So this was a keynote address on Wednesday morning by Joshua Kiriweski, and throughout the conference, especially in one other stalwart session, this came up. So the topic that I'm covering as a takeaway under this modern Agile is the evolved thinking of Agile. So we've been practicing Agile as a manifesto, got published in 2001, and we've been learning as a community, software professionals, learning to do better ways to do software development. And now the evolved thinking on Agile has two main kind of takeaways, subcomponents that I discuss here. One is this topic called Modern Agile, which has 4 kind of principles that Joshua talks about, 4 guiding principles / values. One is making users awesome, and he in fact generalizes this in his evolved thinking to making people awesome, including the users, the developers, the investors, to having that kind of a value focus. Second is making safety a prerequisite, making sure that it is a safe environment to fail, experiment, and learn, and that brings to the third key pillar of value, which is experiment and learn rapidly. And then fourth is, of course, deliver value continuously. Instead of doing a lot of planning and upfront design and all that, just deliver value continuously. So these are 4 key pillars that Joshua talks about as core values of modern Agile. So this is evolved thinking around what we had in the 4 values in the Agile manifesto. And then he covered these 12 practices that overlapping, and I won't go through each of them, as the evolved thinking around what Agile is now. So this is one aspect of evolved Agile, which is called modern Agile now being called. The second came up more directly in the stalwart session. You see in this page by Steve Denning, that now there's been enough work by other management organizations to embrace Agile beyond software development. So the original Agile, as manifesto was written, as you saw in 2001, was for software developers by software developers. And what has happened in the last 15 years is now there's a recognition that the core Agile principles and Agile way of doing work is more broadly applicable beyond just software development. So the support comes from, there's a Harvard Business Review article that very recently, May 2016, I've given reference here. I recommend you should read it. One of the authors of that article is Sutherland, who was one of the co-creators of Scrum. Then McKinsey has done some work recently in this area and of talking about agility hackathons, and McKinsey article on agility. I'll show a page on that next page. So I recommend reading that. So based on these 2 things at least, there's been much more senior management and broad business kind of adoption support for Agile well outside of software organizations themselves. And then Steve himself in his stalwart session, he covered this, that he had written this book a while ago, I think many years ago, and at that time, if you look at the contents of this book, this talks about what he called then radical management, because he felt at that time, 2001 time frame, the general management was not quite ready to adopt Agile. It was very limited to the software development circles. But everything he says in this book about what he calls radical management is actually Agile. So he now clarified, look, he just didn't want to use the term Agile then because it was not acceptable, but now it is. So that's important takeaway, that Agile is now applicable well outside of software development as a general management practice. And I recommend reading this particular article on the next page that I referred to as the McKinsey quarterly article, which says agility it rhymes with stability. So you guys can follow up on that. With that, let me turn it back to Vinayak for the next takeaway.
Yeah, so continuing with my learning for the lean user experience kind of tools, Hemant, you can add, yeah. So various tools are used by lean UX practitioners. You can add one more. So first one was empathy map. So here what you have is you're building a map where you're trying to empathize with the user, and you're seeing what the user sees or noting what the user sees or what he hears, what he says, what he thinks, and what his pain points are, and what are the gains. So as a group, we were given these sticky notes, and we were given this task of writing what a typical user. Now in this case, we were given a user as a shopkeeper who is kind of noticing people walking by his shop because they are playing Pokemon Go, and he's trying to see put his pain points across so that we can empathize with him. So this is an empathy map for a shopkeeper in a mall who sees users passing by a shop. So as you can see, so we wrote down on these sticky notes what he saw. Like I see people looking at their phones and not noticing my shop. I see kids and elders play Pokemon Go. I see people going to my competitor because he has those Pokemon lures, and I see younger people spending more money, etc., etc. So we went on adding more and more of these sticky notes, and we populated the entire map, as you can see in the next build. So we had, once we built it out, we classified or grouped them into things that looked similar. So for example, what he saw at home, what he saw outside his shop, what he saw inside his shop. So those were some of the groups that we formed. So the sticky notes were combined together, and that's what forms the affinity map. So this kind of structure is very useful for you to define the problem space and understand and empathize with the user, because of the user experience, the user is very important. With that, we can take this affinity map and empathy map, and let's see on the next slide. As we can see on the next slide, the input is this affinity map, and then with that, as we can see in the next build, that it creates a output which is basically a design of an experiment that you're going to run in what we call as a A3 map. This was a Toyota practice in which you build an experiment wherein you are basically following the Deming principle. So you create the background, the current situation, analysis and hypothesis based on the empathy map, and then you define what are the measurements and what is the experiment you are going to run, and then what is the outcome of that experiment and what are the next steps or the learning that you have from the experiment. So in Deming, as you can see in the next slide, you are basically talking about building an experiment, PDSA. So plan, then you do something, so which is running the experiment, then study, and then finally the analysis or action that you do. So that is the same Deming kind of cycle that you follow in this A3 map. So we actually did that, and that was something which enabled us to convert the empathy map into an experiment, and noting down the results of the experiment and learning from the experiment. So which is the basic learning from the experiment is the basic principle on which you would be able to get the user experience defined and understand what engages the users. So with that, let's advance to the second tool that we learned. This is, which experiment will you run first, because there are so many different assumptions that you need to validate. So which one is the one which you will be running first? That's one of the questions, because there are so many experiments you can do. So given your limited time and resources, so what we did, we were given different colored sheets or sticky notes, and the blue ones were used for those assumptions where they were assumptions regarding feasibility. So is this technically feasible? Then the second color was green, where whether it is desirable. So desirability assumptions. So whether customers will accept this. So we wrote those assumptions on green sticky notes. And the third color was red or orange, and it was about viability. Will people pay? Will I be able to cover my costs in what the price I'm able to get, etc. So basically things related to viability. So all the assumptions related to viability. So we wrote down all our assumptions, classified them into these three classes, and then as you can see on the next slide, this is something that helped us classify. So this is the business model canvas in which you have feasibility assumptions on the left top quadrant, then the desirability assumptions in the right top corner, and the bottom part is where you have the viability assumptions. So when you write down your assumptions in the business model canvas, that is how you write down your business model. It also helps you to classify into feasibility, desirability, and viability. So as you go on to the next slide, you will see what we do with this is we classify these into risk. So we put, depending on what is important and unknown, in the top left quadrant. So if you have something where the risk is high because you don't know enough about it, and also because it is important, those are the assumptions that you will try to validate first. And those which are unimportant and relatively known, in that case, you would probably not tackle those assumptions upfront. So with this kind of organization of your thought, we were able to distinguish those assumptions which needed to be validated upfront. Now, some of them could be assumptions about technical feasibility, some of them could be assumptions about desirability, or they could be about viability. So as you can see, there are green, orange, and blue sticky notes in all quadrants, but it doesn't matter. What is risky is where you have less knowledge and where it is very important from the point of view of your business plan. So with that, let's go to the next slide, which is, Hemant will talk about it.
Our next takeaway is this topic of Agile is mindset. So as companies have transitioned to Agile over the last many years, one of the key observations that people have, practitioners have in this Agile community is that many of these companies are getting bogged down by tools and processes. So for example, the quote I heard was that we need to have some de-Jirafication. So teams get into a room with Jira screens open, and all they're doing is just updating their stories in Jira, but losing the essence of Agile. So that was important recognition. And this quote from Peter Senge got shown a couple of times in a few sessions, that companies that if it is not enough to change the strategies and structures and systems unless you change the thinking that went into behind those. And that's very important to recognize. So you got to really think of transitioning to Agile as a mindset rather than just following the ceremony. So one illustration of it is to think of Agile Scrum ceremonies, for example, as if you transition to Agile following Scrum, is as training wheels for learning Agile. So you follow Scrum ceremony just as a way to get going, but then you got to evolve and really learn and follow the essence of Agile rather than stay put and stuck at the ceremonial level of Agile, some of the Agile practices. So for example, one idea is around team size. Some teams feel very constrained that they have to follow this magic formula of 7 ± 2 team size. And the recognition is, look, you don't need to. I mean, so long as you are understanding the essence of Agile, delivering value continuously, experimenting and learning, you can have larger teams. And so there were examples where there were team interdependencies, and it was better to combine to even as large as a 30-person team. That is much better way to deliver really essence of Agile than to constrain yourself to team size. Similarly, if you're evolving to Kanban, of course, seems to be much more logical as a way to do continuous delivery, and you let every team follow their own kind of define their own Kanban board that is appropriate for the kind of work that team is doing. In fact, even do away with iteration planning at the beginning, in which sometimes takes half a day or a day. Just follow Kanban, pick the next highest value story, and keep delivering value continuously. So this connects back to the one of the earlier takeaways on modern Agile, which is just understand the evolved thinking around Agile and follow the essence of Agile rather than get bogged down into the ceremonies and the processes and the tool. That's the main takeaway on this one. With that, back to you, Vinayak, for the next one.
Yeah, so DevOps seems to be something that everyone wants to practice, but then there are problems. So starting with number one, so it works on my PC, give me access to prod. So this is a typical anti-pattern where a developer says that, look, this is something which I have tried and it works on my PC, and I don't know why it is not working in production. And you have cases where developers are celebrating on a Friday evening that they have done the release successfully, and the operations people and they're not able to put it in production, and they're having sleepless nights. So this is a typical anti-pattern where you need to have collaboration between developers and operations, which, you know, and developers don't understand that they can't be given access to production because you know, there are legalities involved. People have signed up contracts, and they could be put behind bars if something goes wrong in production. And that's something which developers need to empathize with the operations people and need to do what they are required to do. So that is the now going on to the second one. We built 200 microservices and forgot to set up Jenkins. Now, if you are doing continuous integration, you have to start with the first microservice that you are building. You can't build 200 and then start as an afterthought, because you know, building it in Jenkins is easy, but if you don't have test coverage and if you are not doing test-driven development, it is really not going to help you to do continuous integration, because finally what goes into production at the end of continuous integration has to be checked and tested using the automated services. And if that's not going to happen, you can't start automating after you have already built out 200 microservices. But this is still happening, and this is a typical pattern, anti-pattern that you still see. Going on to the next one, we got fully automated deployment pipeline, but released. We already saw this. You know, when it comes to building, people go on building, but when it comes to releasing, they act gun shy. So you release twice a year because you feel there is risk releasing it in the market, but you go on building it, and then you get user feedback, and by the time you incorporate it, it's too late. There's one more of the anti-patterns. Going to the next one. Yeah, so people are now moving to microservices. It has become very fashionable to containerize and build microservices with Docker, but you know, you need to really architect your monolith in a way with separation of concerns, with proper isolation of network. There are a lot of things that we will see later that we need to do. You can't just take a monolith, put it in a container and call it a microservice. The next one is I use this latest version and it crashed. I mean, many times people think that they should be using the latest version of the software that is available and they should get the updates. But in production, what happens is not everything is supposed to work together with the latest version of what you're downloading. So you need to be very, very careful about that, and you need to have the exact version, exact release predefined for all the components that go into production. And your configuration has to be predefined in terms of the versions. You can't just take the latest version and use that. Going to the next one. I deploy from separate images for dev, test, and production. Now, you deploy to production maybe once in 2 weeks or once in a week, right? Whereas you're deploying to development and test practically every day, and development practically every hour. So, you know, if you are going to have separate images for these three, you know, the risk for production goes up, because the image that you are using in production is not something that has got tested, right? So you're building it just, you know, just before you deploy it, you're building that image. So it doesn't make sense to really do continuous delivery and have separate images for dev, test, and prod. You have to have the same image that is used in all three environments. Going to the next one. Rollback is a separate process than roll forward. Here again, how frequently do you roll back? I mean, rollback happens only once in a while, maybe once in 100 times that you notice that what was rolled forward or what was deployed is not light or not appropriate, so you need to roll back. Now, if your path is separate for rolling back than going forward, then it doesn't get tested or used enough number of times, so you're not confident that when time comes to use that rollback, it's going to work or not. So your rollback should be exact reverse copy of rolling forward, and it should be the same process as the same script that rolls back and the same script should be the one which is actually rolling it forward. So these are some of the anti-patterns, and these are some of the things that, though DevOps has become fashionable, people are not doing it the right way, and you have to be careful. If you are practicing DevOps, you have to make sure that you don't fall into one of these traps. So let's see. This is a typical picture of what I described as the wall of confusion. So you have dev and ops. They are like the development develops something and then they throw it over the wall and they leave it for operations to figure out. So this is the typical problem that DevOps is trying to solve, which is pictorially depicted here. Let's move to the next slide. So the solutions, we already covered those. Automate deployment from day one. Don't do it after 200 microservices are ready. Choose well. Some of the software resists portability, so you have to be careful while choosing what you're choosing. Decoupled components with clearly defined responsibilities and network isolation, we talked about it. Immutable containers and network isolation is very important. Don't treat your containers like VMs. I mean, you can't just take a monolith, put in a container and call it that you have containerized a microservice. You should not put config.yml or properties.xml file in your file system. Use environment variables, and wherever there is storage involved, where your image, containerized image is required to access storage, have attached storage. Use one code base for all deployments. You can't use separate code bases for dev, test, and prod. These are some of the solutions which we already covered when we looked at the anti-patterns. Let's move to the next slide. So this shows the evolution of microservices. So it's not something that, you can't say, you can't have a monolith which is not properly built with no proper isolation of concerns. There is no proper decoupling, and the responsibilities and the interfaces are not well defined, and then suddenly think of converting it to a microservice. It's an evolutionary process. So you have to move from unstructured to namespace to libraries to applications and services, and then finally you will add microservices at the end. So you need to have that discipline built in right from the beginning. You can't just take any monolith which is a proverbial ball of mud and try to convert it to microservices and hope that it will work overnight. With that, let's go to the next slide. So you should take a look at this. This is available. You can look up on Google the 12 factors app. So this was written by Heroku. Very important. So these are the 12 factors you should check before you take any microservice and try to containerize it. Just make sure that all these 12 factors are taken care of before you deploy a microservice in a container. So with that, I'll let Hemant cover the next topic.
Okay, our next takeaway of this topic of lean startup. So as I alluded before, that the Agile Manifesto came around in 2001 or so, most of you know that. And then lean startup thinking came around in 2011 with this book by Eric Ries. And until last year, we felt like there was a bit of an or significant overlap, as you saw in the bottom graphic, between what lean startup thinking and where Agile picked up. And what was very clear this conference is that lean startup thinking has been completely now absorbed and subsumed into the Agile community. So the terminology around what's a minimum viable product, running experiments, doing hypothesis testing, when I talked about thinking of, in the earlier takeaway, thinking of every sprint as a hypothesis-driven sprint, in fact. That's the first time we heard that. So now very clear takeaway is that lean startup is squarely, completely adopted as an inherent part of Agile thinking. It addresses the front end part of Agile, which was ignored before, which is how do you know what you're building, the requirements of the stories, how do you know those are the ones that the customer actually needs? And that's where the lean startup thinking has addressed that, what used to be a weakness, in our opinion, on Agile. So lean startup is now completely part of Agile. With that, back to you, Vinayak.
Yeah, so I attended this session on design thinking. So this design thinking is one of the main pillars on which the the lean startup model is, I mean, design thinking preceded lean startup. So, there are certain, so what is design thinking? So let's just take a look at it. So let's move to the next build. So there are two types of problems. There are mysteries or puzzles, or you can call them a wicked or tame problem. So design thinking is good to address the first type of problems. So it's where you have that case of unknown, where there are mysteries. That is where you have to have design thinking, where there's some kind of discovery involved. It's not a puzzle. So that is there is one way of looking at it. The second one is there are 4 stages where you identify in design thinking: empathize, ideate, prototype, and learning launch. So empathize is a place where you understand, do some kind of user research, then ideate, create ideas, and think of what solution you have. Then think of a prototype or build a prototype, and then launch it and test it. So these are the 4 stages of design thinking. Let's go to the next slide. So this is one more way of understanding what is design thinking. So on one side you have analytical thinking, which is more data driven, where you manipulate quantities. On the other side you have intuitive thinking, so which is more judgment oriented, where you have appreciation of qualities. So design thinking is somewhere in between. It's in the overlap, where you do some analytical and some intuitive thinking. Let's move to the next slide. So in this session, we actually covered some really good tools that we use. So you can look up these tools. These slides are going to be shared with you. So there are 4 phases. So the first phase, as you know, is empathize phase. So what is it? Then the ideate phase, what if? So you try various options and debate what if. Then what now? So you build a prototype, and then what works? You actually test that prototype in the market. So for each one of these phases, there are various tools that you can use. So this is the design thinking toolbox, which is very useful. So you can take this graphic and look up all these tools on Google, and there are several articles and blogs available about these. Let's move to the next one.
Okay, the next takeaway was under this topic of NoEstimates, and the main takeaway here is the evolved thinking about how to deal with estimates. So that the idea that came around largely around 2 sessions. One was that Todd Little, he has done a lot of thinking on this topic of estimation. He had an open space session on Friday, and then it got discussed in various other forums at the conference. So for the purposes of predicting schedule or cost for a software project, the thinking is that there's no real reason to do bottom-up task estimates or detailed story point kind of estimate to arrive at cost or schedule. A better way to do that is just count the stories and use the throughput of your team as stories completed per sprint, let's say, as a throughput measure, and use your burn-up chart to predict the completion date and therefore the budget that the project will have. And that's much more sensible way without wasting too much time, because the statistical data and analysis work shown on this based on a lot of data collected is that there's no information value in detailed estimation. And I'll show a chart on the next page to illustrate this a little further. But the idea is just basically using statistical techniques to forecast date and cost rather than work breakdown structures and all that. Now, having said that, there is probably a learning value for the team to sit down together and have a shared understanding of what each story means and what's the complexity of it and all that. So that is probably value in of itself, but don't confuse that it is going to give you any more precise cost or time schedule estimate. So what you do is, as this graphic shows in this page, that if you use a burn-up chart, your vertical axis is collection of stories, hopefully in a prioritized manner, that gives the scope, and horizontal axis is, of course, time. And the two diagonal lines, the best velocity line and the worst velocity lines, are essentially the throughput of team. And statistically speaking, if you know that with 90% confidence that their velocity is going to be one speed of stories completed per sprint, and the worst, and the worst case version of it is the lower bound, that basically give you a range estimate of whether those two bounds hit the total scope. That's when your project will complete. Now, if the scope changes, the horizontal line keeps moving up, and that gives you a very good way to visualize when the project will be completed. And that's a much more sensible way to get a range estimate of the project completion date and therefore also the cost, rather than any bottom-up estimate. So that's very important takeaway. An application of it that comes up often in capital budgeting is that senior management or executive or board wants to know upfront how much it's going to cost and how much time this project will take. And the advice using this technique is that the management should strive for same level of precision or fidelity in the cost estimate as they are expecting in the value estimate for that project. And often what happens in organizations is they have very vague kind of ideas on the value estimate, how much revenue or how much profit the software project will bring in, but they end up looking for a much more precise estimate on cost, and that's where the fallacy lies. So the takeaway is to strive for same fidelity in the cost estimate. As an organization, you are accepting the fidelity in the value estimate. And this is further discussed in this hashtag NoEstimates that got started a few years ago by Woody's Will, and you guys can follow it. The general idea there is don't spend too much time doing bottom-up estimate that does not add value for delivering value to your business stakeholders. So with that, back to you, Vinayak, for the next takeaway.
Yeah, so a lot of us use personas. In fact, when we write user stories, we say, as a visitor, when I log in on the website, I need to be able to see the home page, etc. So that's how we write our user stories. But really speaking, when you say that as a visitor, what are we talking about? I mean, there could be many different types of visitors. For example, as you see in this picture, the visitor could be a price checker, or he could be, in the case of a hotel, he could be a booked guest, or he could be a loyalty club member, in which again he could be a silver, bronze, or a gold club member, or he could be a known visitor. So there are various roles that we are talking about, and each one of these roles requires a different treatment. Also, the other way of looking at it is, it doesn't matter who the user is or what the persona is, but it matters what he wants to do. For example, if it's a pizza delivery kind of application, it doesn't matter whether you're a student or a housewife or a executive. What matters is you are hungry, right? So what you want is you want to order some food because you're hungry, and that's the job to be done. So there is another framework called the job to be done framework, so you can look it up. So what is important takeaway here is that, going to the next point here, Hemant, that limiting the number of personas benefits the product owner. So this, defining a limited number of personas like visitor, etc., makes it easy for you to write user stories. Otherwise, you would have had to write so many different user stories for different type or different roles that you have. So also, it makes it easy for the marketing people to segment the market in a small defined number of ways and send defined marketing messages for those targets. But it's not really going to help the customer, because customer is not one. There are many different types of customers with different problems, different pain points, and different expectations. Going to the next one. Yeah, so we used role cards. They work better in story mapping. So instead of using personas for story mapping, we use role cards, and that worked pretty well. So that was another takeaway. So I think with that, yeah. The other thing is, so this is one more better understanding of problem with personas, that personas suffer confirmation bias. So when you start, people go into a lot of details when they're describing a persona, that they give a name, they talk about a lot of irrelevant things like, including color of eyes, height, and all demographic things, which are not really relevant for the particular product that is being developed. So that's another thing that happens when you start writing things about personas. You kind of go on writing things which kind of you become you write essays about that persona, but not all of it is relevant. The other takeaway is use active voice while writing user stories. So, for example, when you write as a guest, when I'm checked in, you are actually glossing over one persona, because you don't get checked in as a guest unless there is a receptionist at the desk. So there are two personas involved here. There is a guest and there is a receptionist. So use active voice. If you use passive voice, you tend to gloss over some personas in the process. So with this, let's go to the next one.
Yeah, so our next takeaway was this topic of architecture in Agile. So a lot of teams who have transitioned to Agile struggle with this topic, and this conference was very helpful in pushing clarity around the topic of what is architecture in Agile context, how much to do it and how to handle it in the Agile delivery cycles, and what's the role of architect in Agile teams. So first, what is architecture? So very clearly, and this is largely out of two sessions I attended that I refer to them at the bottom of the page, but there were multiple sessions on this, and there is a general agreement on this topic. The architecture essentially is very simply a shared understanding on design by the team, and it is about decisions about stuff that is hard to change. So, and that's what they call it, important stuff, whatever that is. Let's just call that architecture, not get too bogged down by, it may be a technology stack, Ruby on Rails versus .NET, because that's hard to change and that's important, so maybe that's architecture. So the specifics don't matter, but this is how you define architecture. And the important driver is the irreversibility of that decision is what drives complexity. And so what architects have to do is make sure they minimize things that are hard to change, and things that are hard to change, make them easier to change, design it that way. And they should just focus themselves on important stuff, whatever that is in this case. So let's spend a little bit more time on how to handle this topic of architecture, which is in Agile community has adopted this notion of emergent architecture. So on the one extreme on the left side is your usual waterfall style or some variation thereof under big design upfront or some design upfront. So those are too much. A team should not be doing that much upfront. On the right extreme is the completely maverick cowboy style, start coding without any due thought on the topic of architecture. And what Agile recommends, the community recommends, is this healthy balance closer to the right called emergent architecture. So the point is some architecture decisions do need to be made before you write your first line of code. So you may spend maybe half a day or a day doing architecture session, and you just invite anybody who has something to offer, whether they are a QA person or a product owner or a senior developer, doesn't matter. Everybody is invited who has something to contribute. You have that discussion and you make those bigger decisions in that session, and then you start delivering value. But you don't need to overspend by having an architecture sprint or a sprint zero, which is spending 2 weeks or entire sprint doing architecture. I think that is not consistent with the basic Agile value of delivering value every sprint to customer. So that's how you handle architecture, and the role of architect essentially along the lines of guilds in Spotify. The main clarity on architect role, it is not a team by itself, not a separate team. Architects are hands-on developers, are a core part of a regular sprint or Scrum teams. And there are three basic roles. First role is to serve the business, which is captured in this quote of economics over craftsmanship. So business interest comes first rather than striving towards a purist craftsmanship type architecture thinking. Second is related to the first, which is help IT serve the business. And third, of course, is they are coaches and mentors to teach the team to do architecture themselves so that they don't become bottleneck. I'm going to skip over, in the interest of time, the rest of the bullets on this page. You can look up this stuff. With that, back to you, Vinayak, on the next.
Yeah, so this, again, I'll, in the interest of time, very quickly cover. So visual test automation tools are being used. So we at Synerzip use tools like ImageMagick and Sikuli, but here we came across a new tool called ApplyTools. So in case of older tools, they do pixel by pixel comparison, and as a result, what happens, a slight offset, you would get an error, or unless if it's a proportionate picture but a smaller size, it would still give an error. Whereas here in ApplyTools, it does take into account offsets and proportions. So because of which you get more appropriate reports. Not only that, quickly advance to the next ones. So it not only has this ability to take care of size proportion, but also it maintains version control. So as you can see on the next slide, you can do branching and merging. So let's move to the next slide. So you can do branching and merging. So you can't use, for images, you can't use your regular GitHub or Git repository. These are large in size, so you can't check those in. So for you to maintain these images and have operations such as branching and merging, ApplyTools has their own cloud-based version control system, which allows you to do branching and merging. So that is another advantage. So it not only takes care of offsets and proportions, but also it takes care of version control, branching and merging. So you can look it up. ApplyTools is a better tool than what we had known before. That was the takeaway from this particular session. With that, I'll let Hemant handle the next one.
Okay, so this is actually our final takeaway on scaling Agile. This has been a topic in the conference almost every year. The update on the topic of scaling Agile when you go beyond, say, 10-ish teams to much larger number of teams, is the first thing is there's a new scaling framework being proposed by Scrum.org called Nexus, which essentially is a core, adding a core team, nucleus team, which goes around and handling the interdependencies of integration and so on across teams. And I'll flash a picture of that. You guys can read up more on scrum.org. Next takeaway on this topic of scaling Agile is that Scrum, the safe is still pretty much, even though people have a lot of resistance that it is over complicated, a framework and all that. If you talk to larger companies participating in the conference, safe appears to be still widely adopted as the basic framework for scaling Agile, and they all customize it. And that brings back to the general consensus on scaling Agile, is that while there are half a dozen or so frameworks out there between Jeff Sutherland's Scrum of Scrum, Craig Larman's Large Scale Scrum, and so on, you can read all of these here. The general consensus is that pick and choose components of these various scaling frameworks and tailor your own. Whatever is suitable for your organization, the PMO requirements you may have in your office, the governance requirements you may have in your organization, you pick and choose the framework that is most suitable to you. You don't have to only take one of them or take everything in any one of them. So that's the main kind of takeaway. With that, we are pretty much done with the time. So we're going to skip over the Soundbites. We'll make the document available to you. You can browse through any part of it, follow up on the links we have provided. And I'll do a quick intro to Synerzip for those who are new to us. Let me go through this and wrap it up at that level. So those who are new to us, we are essentially a trusted outsourced product development partner company, and we help our clients accelerate their delivery roadmap and address any of the skill gaps they may have in their in-house team, and do that while saving significantly on the overall cost, and therefore do it capital efficiently. We have a team locally on the US side as well as team in India, and that combination helps us provide best value to our clients. So with that, you guys reach out to us if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll make this document available. And I'm sorry we couldn't take any questions along the way. It became such a rush session with these 10 or 12 takeaways that we covered for you guys. But hopefully, you got something out of it.